In this video, we're going to look at how to create final gather maps, how to work with them. Also, we're going to look at some of the new features that pertain to final gather mapping in 3ds Max 2010. And we're also going to look at Mentorate diagnostic features that allow us to visualize and get a better idea of how final gather is working and how to troubleshoot it, things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot to cover here. Let's go ahead and collapse the final gather rollout here. And let's go to this rollout down here to reuse final gather and GI disk caching rollout. Now, in the global illumination chapter, we looked at how to use the global illumination mapping parameters here. Now, in this case, we're working with final gathering. So the top set of parameters up here are going to deal with final gather mapping. The final gather can be mapped, just like with global illumination, how we saw earlier. When we were creating the photon maps for global illumination, we were saving out the photon maps and we were writing them to the disk. We can do the same exact thing for final gather. But final gather has a few different options that are unique to it, and I'm going to go over that stuff now. Let's start from the top here and work our way down. The first up here is the mode. This parameter has two options. We can set the first option, which is a default that's been used in the past with Mentorate, which is to create a single file only. And as the comment here says, it's best for walkthroughs and stills. This is the default. Basically what happens is final gather creates a single final gather map file that you can name to whatever you like. And this final gather map file can be reused later to load up. That way you don't have to calculate final gather over and over again. You can just calculate it once and freeze it and reuse it over and over again. Okay? We do have a new option here though. I had to turn it down the video. My throat made a very, very strange and disturbing sound. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. We do have another option down here, and this option is the one file per frame option, and as the comment here in parentheses suggests, it's best for animated objects. Okay, with final gathering, you could get flickering whenever you have animation, especially when you have objects being animated in scene, like say character or any static objects that are maybe moving around in your scene, things like that. So this option is good for whenever you have a situation like that, when you have animation and a lot of stuff moving around in your scene, because this option creates one final gather map file per frame. So if you have 100 frame animation, you can end up creating 100 different final gather map files, one for every single frame. And the benefit to this is that it helps to reduce and eliminate final gather flickering and artifacting that can occur when doing animation with a lot of moving objects and characters with final gather. So it's a good new option here that is great if you're doing animation. Okay. Right here we have a redundant option to calculate FG, GI, and skip final rendering option. Basically, this is off by default, and if you turn it on, when you render out, Mentorate is just going to calculate the final gather or the global illumination map, whichever you have active, and it's just going to calculate it, and that's it. It's just going to calculate the map, save it to the disk, and it's not going to render out the actual image in order to save yourself some time. But this option is redundant simply because we can do the same thing and easier if we go down to these buttons down here, which we'll see in a moment, like the Generate Final Gather Map File Now button or the Generate Photon Map File Now button, which we've seen in a previous chapter. So I won't go over that again. Down here we have Final Gather Map, and we can actually choose a few different options here. Now the default option is off. What this means is that whenever we've calculated Final Gather Map, which we've been doing several times already in the previous videos, the Final Gather Map is not saved to the hard drive. So far, the final gather map has just been created as we needed it, but Mentorate doesn't save it. It just throws it out. We can change that behavior, however. We have two options for doing that. We have the first option here, which incrementally adds final gather points to map files. This basically means that final gather maps are going to be created and saved to the hard drive. Or we can choose this bottom option here, which only reads final gather map files. The same thing as with global illumination down here when we worked with it in a previous chapter. Using this option here will only read a final gather map file if it's already been created. If there is no final gather map file, then it just won't do anything. So before we can actually read a final gather map file and reuse it, we have to create it. So let's go ahead and create it. Let's go here and use the second option, which is incrementally add final gather points to map files. Once we do that, you notice here we'll be able to see the location and the name of the file. In this case, the file is automatically named as temp.fgm. FGM just being the extension for final gather map. So let's hit the browse button here, and when we get this window, we can actually go ahead and put in final gather map, and I have a few here from earlier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take these and delete them. Editor, we're going to edit that part out of the video. I just deleted the file, so we're going to start again in 3, 2, 1. So let's hit the browse button here, and we can actually create ourselves a final gather map, and it's going to place them in the same project folder as the photon maps that we were creating with global illumination. So the default name is temp.fgm, FGM being for the final gather map. We can put in whatever name we want. So let's call this my FG map. Okay. Now let's hit save. Now we're ready to create the final gather map. Now we can create it very easily. All we have to do is hit this button here that says generate final gather map file now. So once we do that, Mental Ray will calculate the final gather map. There it goes. And it's done. Okay. Once it's done, let's hit the browse button here. And we can see that there it is. It's in the project folder. It's been saved out. myfgmap.fgm. Let's right click, go to view. And let's switch this to details mode so we can see the size. The size of this final gather map is about 2.5 megabytes, about 2.5 megabytes. Okay, so let's hit cancel there. All right, we also have this drop down list. If you notice, there's this little button with a black arrow icon here on the right. This drop down list is new in 3ds Max 2010. And what it basically allows you to do, it allows you to render out the final gather map a few different ways. You can render out just the current frame, which is the equivalent of just hitting the generate final gather map file now button. We also have a few different options here. We have an option to render out from 0 to 100 every 1 frame. We can render out every 3 frames, every 5 frames, every 10 frames, or every 20 frames. So what are these options for? Well, basically, Mental Ray looks at what the size of your animation is set up as. If we go to the Common tab of the Render Setup window, and we go down to the Time Output options right here, we have it set to single. But if we go to range, you'll notice that it's set from 0 to 100. Why is that? Well, let me close this window and show you. Down here in the animation slider, we have an animation that's from 0 to 100 frames. Now, nothing in this scene is animated, but by default, 3ds Max has this thing set up as if there was an animation from 0 to 100. So if I go back to the render setup window, let me move this back to the right. Our default animation time range is set from 0 to 100. Let me go back to the indirect illumination tab here of Mental Ray. So basically what this means is that it's going to go from 0 to 100 because that's the size of our animation right now, our theoretical imaginary animation. And you can actually tell Final Gathering to render out for every single frame, every 3 frames, every 5 frames, every 10 frames, every 20 frames. Okay? So what that means is that, say if you render out every 10 frames, your render time is actually going to be much faster because you're not rendering out 100 frames of Final Gather. You're just rendering out every 10 frames. So 10 divided into 100 is 10. So you're basically just rendering out Final Gather 10 times as opposed to 100 times. Because if I were to go in here and render out every single frame and select that option, Mental Ray will start to render this out. So you notice it renders out frame 1, then it renders out frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and here's the total animation progression here. Basically, this bar has to go from the left all the way to the right. And you can see, even though it's going pretty fast, it's going to take it a few minutes before it completes the entire animation to 100 frames. So in order to render out faster, let's hit cancel. In order to render out faster, you might want to render out every 10 frames. And if we did that, you notice now that the progression is going to go a lot faster. There it goes. So it's rendering out in big chunks now. See how much faster it's rendering out? So I can render out a 100 frame animation in 1/10 of the time. So that's how that works. So you can do that based on your scene. Okay, so you have those options there for rendering out a little bit faster. Now up here you notice that there's this grayed out option that says interpolate over n frames, n being a number that you choose here in this option box here. But you notice that it's grayed out and I can't use it. The reason for that is because we have to do something here. We have to switch from single file only to 1 file per frame. So basically the animated mode, it'll still be grayed out. So what we need to do is we need to come in here and switch from add final gather points to map files. We have to switch to read final gather points only. Once we do that, the option becomes available. What this means is that if we were to render this out one file per frame, and let's actually go ahead and let's do that. Let's go to the browse window here. We only have one final gather map here. Let me hit cancel. But if I go ahead and render out one final gather map, one file per frame, okay, and I go ahead and I create this, so I'll switch to the incrementally add final gather points to map files option, which grays this out, by the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do one frame. I'm going to go ahead and create one file per frame. I'm not going to do like every 5 or 10 frames. I'm not going to be cheap. I'm going to go ahead and do every frame, even though it's going to take a little bit longer. So there it goes. It's rendering that stuff out. What I'll do is I'll pause the video and I'll come back when it's finished rendering out 100 frames. Alright, now that I finished rendering that out, let me hit the browse button here. And whoa, look what we have here. Basically what we have is a sequence of final gather map files. For example, we have a final gather map file for frame 0000. We have one for 0001, frame 2, frame 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 100. So we've basically created 100 different final gather map files. Let me hit cancel on that. Okay, so that's what that option does. By switching to one file per frame, it's going to go ahead and render out one final gather map per frame, which helps to reduce flickering, artifacting, and any type of lighting inconsistencies, and flickering, things like that. Alright, now with that done, what I can do is go down to the read final gather points only from existing map files. Once I do that, it won't create final gather maps over and over again. It's just going to read the file and render out. So if I hit the render button here, notice it just goes straight to rendering. There's the final gather effect. It didn't calculate final gather over and over again. It just rendered it out. Now the interpolate over n frames option here is actually pretty important. What this mode does, the one file per frame mode, it basically uses this option here, the interpolate over the number of frames mode, to be able to say, okay, you've got all of these different final gather map files, right? So let me go to the browse button to kind of illustrate this a little bit better. So let's say on frame 10 over here, when it renders out frame 10, Mental Ray is going to look at this option here, which is set to 2, and it's going to interpolate the final gather points at frame 10, and it's going to interpolate them 2 up and 2 down. So it's going to look at 2 files above frame 10 and 2 files below frame 10, and it's going to interpolate all those final gather points in order to reduce flickering and get rid of artifacting and give you a nice animated result. So it's going to look at frame 11 and 12, since that's 2 above 10, and it's going to interpolate them with frame 10. It's also going to look at 2 below 10, so it's going to look at frames 9 and 8 and interpolate those with frame 10 to give you a nice, smooth, good result for your animation. So that's the only thing that this option here controls. Now you can change the option. You can tell it to interpolate over 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you want. I recommend going with the default option of 2. 2 works out pretty well. If you see it, you're having any type of artifacting problems or anything like that, you can always go ahead and increase this to maybe 3 or maybe even 4 frames to be able to get yourself a pretty good artifact-free, flicker-free final gather animation. So now let's say that I don't want this final gather map that I've created here, so I'm going to hit this red X button to delete it. 3ds Max is going to ask me, are you sure you want to delete? I'll hit yes. Now if I go to the browse button, you can see I don't have any more final gather maps. It deleted all of them. It didn't delete 1 or 2 frames. It deleted the entire animation of frames. So they're all gone. So let me hit cancel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to the single file only, so I don't create like 100 files, just one. That's all I need. And I'm going to go and create, I'm going to switch to incrementally add final gather points to map files. Okay? And I'll hit the browse button. I'm going to leave the name alone. I'm going to leave the name at myfgmap, which is fine. Okay? And what I'm going to do is simply render this out. And when I render this out, there's the final gather. It's going to finish and render out the image. When I go to the browse button, there's my final gather map right there. It's still about 2.5 megabytes. So I'll hit cancel. Okay. Now if I go ahead and switch to read final gather points only, then it's going to go ahead and render out, and it's not going to calculate final gather over and over again. But you probably expected that. What you're probably not expecting is what I'm about to show you now. Let me turn the camera around and render this out from a different angle. An angle that I didn't render out final gather from before. And now let me render this out, see what happens. Uh-oh, we have ourselves a pretty big problem here. The problem is there's no final gather points for this area over here. There's only final gather for that little area over there that I rendered out from. But you can see there's artifact in here. There's this strange dark shadow spot here. And the backs of these buildings are dark. They don't have any final gather indirect illumination on them. The reason is because, as I've said before, final gather is view dependent. Now, there's a way that we can view the final gather points in the render and be able to visualize this much better. And we can find that in the diagnostic tools for mental ray. So how do we do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Let's go to the processing tab here, and you'll see that there's 3 tabs: translator options, diagnostics, distributed bucket rendering. We're going to go to diagnostics. Now we can go ahead and enable the visual diagnostics here, and we have a few diagnostics we can do. We can check out the sampling rate, coordinate space, photons, BSP, and final gather. Let's go with final gather. So we'll turn that on. Let's go back to indirect illumination, and let's go ahead and render this out again. And when we render out again, we're going to see these green dots all over the place. These green dots represent areas that have been saturated with final gather points. So think of them as the final gather points. Okay. Now final gather points are not green, but this is just a visual aid that shows them in this neon green color so that you can see them easily. So basically, where we see green, we're seeing final gather. That's good. Wherever we don't see green, those are areas that didn't get any final gathering points. That's bad. Okay. That's why the areas over here look pretty bad and the areas in green look pretty good. All right. So let's actually come in and zoom in here on this little sphere. And if we render out again, we're going to see a blind spot behind the sphere that looks like a shadow. That's the area behind the sphere that didn't get any final gather points, because when we rendered out with the camera, we rendered out from in front of the sphere, and we missed this entire section here simply because final gather points only work with what the camera sees. So the way you want to work with final gather is you want to add points, final gather points, to the entire scene. How can we do that? Well, let's switch back to incrementally add final gather points to map files. This option here, this final gather map mode, is going to make sure that every time we render out our single map here, this map file is going to go ahead and get more and more final gather map points. Now, let me right click, go to view, and switch to details mode. Okay. Now, this final gather map right now is 2.5 megabytes. It's about 2.5 megabytes big, which actually isn't big. It's actually pretty small. Okay. What I'm going to do is, with my final gather map mode set to the second option, which is going to add final gather points to the map, to the current map, which is called my FG map. If I go ahead and start doing renders, you notice now that I'm going to be able to distribute final gather points to the entire scene here. But there still are little nooks and crannies, little holes, little crevices and things like that, little alleyways in between these objects that are not getting final gather points. And I'll just go ahead and close that. I'll come back here. Let me go ahead and switch back to read only, just so I don't create any more final gather points. I'll render again. And you notice that when I render this out from behind, what I'm going to end up with is a whole bunch of blank spots, areas where there's no final gather points. So there's a lot of areas that I'm missing. So if I want to render this out with final gathering properly, the whole thing, I have to basically saturate the entire scene here with final gather points. Okay, so you notice there's a bunch of areas here that are missing these little green dots. That's not good. So I'll hit escape on the keyboard here to cancel the render out. What I'm going to do is switch back to add final gather points to map files, and I'm going to render this out from different angles. So I'll render out from here, and basically the way you can think of this is pretend like your camera, the viewport right now, is a can of spray paint, and the spray paint that you're spraying onto your scene is final gather point paint. I guess you can think of it that way. So you're trying to spray paint as much final gather points onto your scene as possible. So rotate your camera, look at it from different angles, try to see any spots that you may have missed, and try to get those final gather points to fill in those voids, those spots, those missing areas. Okay? So let's pretend like I did a thorough, very good job of filling this scene up with final gather points. So you can see we have a lot of final gather points all over the place. Okay, so once I do that, I can go ahead and go back to the read only mode, which basically freezes the final gather map. And now when I render this out, I'm not going to recreate any final gather points. I'm just going to reuse the map over and over again. Now to get rid of the diagnostics here, what I can do is just go back to processing and uncheck enable. And now, whenever I render out, I won't get those green dots all over the place. So now I'm getting final gathering in my scene. It's looking pretty good. I did a good job here. Put some final gather points all over the scene from different angles. You can see here actually there's some spots that I missed, but that's okay. You can always go back and replenish that area with more final gather points. So I think you get the idea, which is to saturate your scene with final gather points so that you can render this out from any angle you want and not have a problem. So there you go. Now one last thing, if we go back to the browse button and we look at this final gather map here, we look at details, you notice that the final gather map grew in size. It went from 2.5 megabytes, it's now almost 16 megabytes, just under 16 megabytes. So it grew. It got very, very big. It grew to about 8 times its original size. So that's one thing you want to make a note of. The more final gather points you have in your scene, the larger the final gather map file. So it's very important to keep that in mind when working with final gathering and creating these final gather maps. So there you go. That's how you can use diagnostics with final gathering. Also, this is how you work with these final gather map files. You can see we have plenty of options and we can combine them different ways to get different results, but I think you get a good overall idea and pretty good detailed view of how to work with these final gather maps and how you can use them to your advantage, whether you're doing an animated project here or you're doing just a rendered still of an architectural scene or something like that. So I'm going to end this video here, and in the next one we're going to go ahead and talk about some other aspects here of mental ray.